Now let's take this example. I have fetched an object from the database and I have used this to say render some a page or screen to the user. Now the user is going to look at the screen and then react to it and enter some inputs. Now what I need to do is I need to take the user inputs and then update the the record back to the database. It's a very common scenario. It happens most of the times. So what I'm doing is I'm getting the data, displaying it to the user, and then updating the data with the user inputs and sending it back. Now, the problem with this scenario is that there is going to be a think time when it comes to the user. Now, when I render this, the display to the user is going to take some time. It might be 5 seconds, it might be 10 seconds, it might even be a minute. Now, the problem here is that I will have to wait for that duration here, and I don't know how long I need to wait. And then I need to make an update. So it's not a good idea to have all of these inside a single transaction. So what I'll do is I'll have one transaction. I'll open a session where I open a transaction and get the data here. I'll close the transaction, close the session, and then I will let the user take his or her time when it comes to making the input. And then once I get the user's input, I'm going to open another session where I'm going to do the update. Now the problem is that once I've got the entity object here, it is persistent. Now I cannot wait. I need to close the session here. The moment I close the session, it's going to be detached. And now I wait for the user input here. Now the user makes an input. Now I have the update here. I have the updated value. And now I need to save it back to the session, which means that I need to have this object back to a persistent state again. Now, how do I move an object from the detached state to a persistent state? Now, once I do that, once I make this object back to a persistent state, the user input, updation is as simple as setting the properties of this object, of the persistent object. But now, how do I move it from detached to persistent? So that's something that we're going to look at now. Okay, you can see here I'm doing a session.get of the user object with the primary key of 1. Now this is the first part of the process. Now I have an object that I'm getting from the database, and once I've got the object, I'm closing the transaction and I'm closing the session. Now I have displayed this object related information to the user, and I'm waiting for the user input now. Now I cannot open the transaction for long. I'll close this. Now I can wait for the user input as long as I want. Now this probably will be another method with a handle to this object. So let me place this inside an object. Okay, so what I'll do is now I have this user object which I'm going to use to render the view to the user, and I'll wait for the user input, and then there'll be another method or another class which will run to update this user object once we get the input from the user. Now there has to be a way in which I can make this user object become persistent once again. So what I'll do is let me open a new session here. Okay, again this code will probably be in a different method or in a different class, but for simplicity I'm going to put this in the same class, and the idea is to see how we can attach the user object back to the session by opening a new session. So what I'll do here is I'll again do a session.begin transaction. Now I will have the updated value here, so probably what I'll do is user.set username. Now I'll set the username as updated username after session close. Okay, since I'm updating this after the session close, it's not going to get updated in the database. Now I'll have to somehow find a way to update this user in the database. I'll call the session dot update. Now the session.update takes an object as argument. I will pass the user object here. So what I'm telling Hibernate is to update this user by finding out which record it is that needs to be updated. Now I'm not going to give more details. All the information is already available in the user object. It knows what's the primary key. The primary key has not changed here. As you can see, I'm using the same object. So as long as I have a handle to the object, even though it's in a detached state, I can again merge it back to a persistent state. So once I do this, it's going to update. It's going to send out an update query, and then it's going to update the corresponding record in the database, and the value will be the updated username after session close. So let's test this out. I will close this transaction as well, the second transaction, and I'll commit the transaction. I'll close this. Now let's have a look at what is the value. Now of course I will change the hpMT_detail.auto to update because I don't want this to go away. I already have a user with ID 1. Okay, so now let's run this. So here you can see it does a select and it does an update. Now the select is for the get. We got this object from the first session and we close the session, and then now I change this property and now I'm doing an update, and this update is triggering the update query. So now if you can look at the data record, here you can see that the change that I've made after the close of the first session has been reflected in the database. In the second session, Hibernate has figured out what is the row that corresponds to this user, even though it's removed from the session, and then it automatically attaches back to the session. Now there are a couple of things to note here. The first thing is that if I make any changes to the user object here, after I do an update, it is automatically going to persist it. So I can do a user dot set username, and I can say change after update. This will be updated as well. So it's not going to run more than one update query because it knows that only one is required. So here you can see it updates that as well. So what it's actually doing is not only it is updating the value, it is also making this the user object as a persistent object. So whatever changes you make here will be persisted. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing to note here is that let's say I do not make any changes to the user object. I'm just getting the object here and I'm detaching it, and then in the second session I am attaching it. I'm doing an update and attaching it back to the session, the second session. Now if I run this, notice what happens. Now even though I have not made any changes to the user object, it is going to run the update query. It's going to do a update user details. Now why is it doing that? The reason it's doing that is Hibernate does not know if anything has changed in the user object. Now as long as the user object is in the session, as long as the user object is persistent, Hibernate keeps track of changes. Okay, you make a change in a property, Hibernate knows, okay, this has to be updated. It marks this property as dirty, and it knows that an update query has to be triggered. But now since this object is coming from another session, Hibernate does not know what is the value that's saved in the database. So unless it does an update, it cannot be sure that the current value of the user gets reflected to the record in the table. So to be on the safer side, Hibernate does the update query so that any further changes you make can also be persisted and there is no data inconsistencies. There is a way to avoid this though. Say you want to make sure the object has changed before doing an update. So what you do is you ask Hibernate to first do a select and see if the user object that you're trying to update is any different from what's already there in the table. Now you can tell Hibernate to make an update query, to fire an update query only if something has changed in the user object. And if nothing has changed in the user object, don't run any update queries, just attach this back, make this back to a persistent state. So in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to go to the entity class itself, and you have to have an entity annotation. Now this annotation is specific to Hibernate. It's not a Java JPA annotation. So we need to use the Hibernate entity annotation in order to specify this. So the way I do this is below the Java x.persistence.entity annotation, I also use the Hibernate entity annotation. So that is org dot hibernate dot annotations dot entity. So I need to give the fully qualified name because I already have an entity annotation here. So this entity annotation of Hibernate has a property called select before update, and this you can set it to true. Now what am I doing by setting this to true? I'm saying, hey Hibernate, make sure you do a select first before you do any updates, and make update queries only if there is something that needs to be updated. So this is applicable for the whole entity. It's not just the dot update. So we're going to look at a couple of other scenarios where this is applicable, but for now, when you do a session.update of any entity, not only does it attach itself to the the persistent state, it also instead of firing an update query directly, what it does is it just does a select first, and if the select comes up with a different set of data in the table which is different from what is there in this user object right now, then it also fires an update query. But if it is the same, it does not fire the update query. So let's test that out one more time. Now again, I'm not making any changes to the user object here. So now when I run this, here you can see there are two selects that are happening. So the first select is for this session.get. I'm getting the user object and I'm saving it into this user details object. Now I'm doing the session.close. Now in the new session, I'm doing a session.update. Normally what would happen is it would just, to be on the safe side, would just fire an update query. But now since I've done a select before update, what it does is it executes another select and it gets the current state of the data in the table. Now it figures out that this, the state is the same. I haven't made any changes here, so it is not going to fire the update query. But however, if I make a change here, set username, and you change the name here, now what will happen is Hibernate will, before doing an update, it runs a select, and then it figures out that something has changed, and then it runs another update query. So let's test that out. So here you see the first select is to get the object, and now in the second session, when I do a user.session.update of user, it first does a select, sees that okay, something has changed. Now it's going to update the data in the in the database. Now the select before update is useful if most of the times you wouldn't change anything. You just want to attach the object back to the session. But if there is a chance that the the object might have been changed, if it's a good chance, then it's better not to do a select or select before update, because it's going to run another select query, and then after that it's going to run an update query on top of that. So you can save an update query if you know that the session, if the object might not be changed, but if there is a good chance that the object might be changed, it's a good idea to not do a select before update.